We saw how Frankenstein took his model of Promethean power from the destructive effects of a lightning bolt that he witnessed on a beautiful old oak tree. I never beheld anything so utterly destroyed. The catastrophe of this tree excited my extreme astonishment, and I eagerly inquired of my father the nature and origin of thunder and lightning. He replied, electricity. These are sketches by Darwin of genealogical trees, trees of evolution, of variation and evolution through generations. And this corresponds to Eliot's prime metaphor for the source of life and also our understanding of life, the interweaving of reality and metaphor itself. Eliot says, I don't have time for cosmic knowledge, for Promethean projects of comprehension. I have too much to do in unraveling certain human lots and seeing how they were woven and interwoven, that all the light I can command must be concentrated on this particular web and not dispersed over that tempting range of relevancies called the universe. That's not Victor's light. Victor's electricity is a commanding power, unilateral power that is measured by its capacity to destroy the tree. The Romantics demonstrate and taught Eliot a lot about how writing and art, this, as she puts it here, this unraveling of human lots and seeing how they were woven and interwoven. Poetry and art examines these weaves and contributes to these weaves. Fabrication of human community, human society. I've mentioned that Eliot is very fond of aphorisms, as you'll notice, little pearls of wisdom. Eliot's aphorisms can be earnest or satirical, like the one we looked at last time. Everybody acts alike, so that if there are any lunatics about, they'll be easy to identify. That's satirical, right? Her aphorism is expressing the attitude of a fearfully conformist point of view. It's not her point of view. She's mocking this fearful conformism. And so Blake's Proverbs, this is how a lot of Blake's poetry in general works, through mockery, imitating distorted perspectives. In Blake's Proverb of Hell, it's interesting to see that it's sort of a mix. And I organized them here in terms of the songs of innocence and experience. You could correlate them with the perspective of the child and the perspective of the adult. I mean, a big part of Blake has to, and Romanticism has to do with espousing the intelligence of children and reminding adults of what they've forgotten about that intelligence. And just as an aside, that's a huge and growing part of psychology now. Developmental psychology has to do with exactly this idea, the separate intelligence of children, and how it is a very neglected, oft neglected kind of learning, distinct kind of learning and intelligence that adults often lose and even denigrate. The many other oppositions underlie this grand opposition between innocence and experience. So the main thing is experience breeds attachment to explicit rules, that abiding rules, so controlling life according to consistent, explicit rules, and explicit knowledge that does not change. So a big part of experience is just figuring out a certain system of how things work, and sticking with that system, trying to exploit it for all it's worth, and resisting whatever doesn't fit that system. And it's a point of view that works. That's why people use it. It's effective, but it's limiting and potentially destructive. Blake emphasizes it breeds fear and loss aversion. Life becomes a threat. The very unpredictability of life becomes a threat to you because of your attachment and dependence on this unchanging, inflexible system. And these are characteristics of adulthood. This adulthood breeds loss aversion. And confirmation bias. That's another thing, that we get more and more attached to what we already know, that we even stop seeing what doesn't fit what we already know. Whereas innocence has much more to do with curiosity, play, experimental action over knowledge. Children actually have a falsification. They're biased. They're more interested in discovering things that falsify what they already know. And there's a powerful intelligence in that. But courage, that curiosity takes courage. And that's a kind of love, affirmation of the world despite its unpredictability. So you can see that this idea of a weaving and interweaving versus the commanding view of the universe. Remember Eliot's paradoxical formulation. It's dividing moral and immoral is itself immoral. So don't get lured into thinking that innocence is all good and experience is all bad. It's about recognition of the interrelatedness of all things, intermediation, marching through the middle. But these are overstated. It's not as simple as this. His most notorious statement: sooner murder an infant in its cradle than nurse unacted desires. Something with it that has a kernel of truth. What breeds pestilence, the standing water, is self-censorship, self-inflicted repression, like the internalized racism of the little black boy, internalized repression. So again, the fox condemns the trap, not himself. We've internalized our own trap. So that self-cancellation is a more pernicious crime than even murder. At least a murder is out in the open and invites the world to respond. If you just kill yourself, kill your desire, you just you normalize a deadened world. The thankful receiver bears a plentiful harvest. To create a little flower is the labor of ages. So all this interaction, everything is dependent on everything else. Everything that has been is the condition of what is now. Every accident, every folly is the condition of our present wisdom. And perhaps my favorite of all the proverbs: the bird a nest, the spider a web, man friendship. We live in our relationships. We are a consequence of our mutual recognition of one another, recognition of each other's difference, social concern, friendship. Friendship is such a key term, not just for Blake, but for the Romantics in general, because it is the core, the kernel of social interaction, and it's non-hierarchical. It's not like husband or father or other relationships defined by the nuclear family or other kinds of social institutions and hierarchies. It is a term defined by practice. A friend is what a friend does. So again, back to that functionalism of Comte and Feuerbach and Marx. Friendship is what friendship is defined in how we invent it in action. We live in that web of interrelationship that we make. So think about how this metaphor, friendship as our habitat, our web, see how this metaphor applies to different relationships in Middlemarch. I think you can notice certain relationships that are very rigid and, based in tradition, patriarchal tradition especially. And then relationships that break out of that and are more experimental and blur boundaries. And finally, think about how the metaphor itself contributes to the web. I was just talking about how friendship is what friendship does. Likewise, the web is what the web does. Eliot's text is a web. Her literature, including metaphors like the web, teach us and give us practice in social concern, social empathy. We develop relationships with all these imaginary characters. Our relationship with imaginary characters we read about involve real emotion, real emotional intelligence. So noticing what our patriarchal culture disguises, hides, increasing the intellectual division of labor, noticing the embodied costs of what we take to be normal. It's exactly what Middlemarch, the mission of Middlemarch is, as Eliot defines it in the prelude, noticing those lost to oblivion. Rebecca Solnit writes, I think a lot about obliteration, or rather that obliteration keeps showing up. It's another paradoxical formulation. The appearance of absence, noticing absence. I have a friend whose family tree has been traced back 1,000 years, but no women exist on it. She just discovered that she herself did not exist, but her brothers did. Her mother did not exist, nor did her father's mother or her mother's father. There were no grandmothers. Fathers have sons and grandsons, and so the lineage goes, with the name passed on. The tree branches, and the longer it goes on, the more people are missing. Sisters, aunts, mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers, a vast population made to disappear on paper and in history. Her family is from India, but this version of lineage is familiar to those of us in the West from the Bible, where long lists of begats link fathers to sons. The crazy 14-generation genealogy given to the New Testament's Gospel according to Matthew goes from Abraham to Joseph, without noting that God and not Joseph is supposed to be father of Jesus. The tree of Jesse, a sort of totem pole of Jesus' patrilineage as given to Matthew, was represented in stained glass and other medieval art and is said to be the ancestor of the family tree. This coherence of patriarchy, of ancestry, of narrative is made by erasure and exclusion. Eliminate your mother, then your 2 grandmothers, then your 4 great-grandmothers. Go back more generations, and hundreds, then thousands disappear. Mothers vanish, and the fathers and mothers of those mothers. Even more lives disappear as if unlived, until you've narrowed a forest down to a tree, a web down to a line. This is what it takes to construct a linear narrative of blood or influence or meaning. It's really powerful. She's talking about patriarchy, of course, but she's talking more than that about linear narrative, linear causality, reducing the story of experience to discrete chains of events, reduces a web down to a line, a forest down to a tree. So she's asking us, like Eliot, to notice this background web of implication in embodied experience and material conditions. It's not just about patriarchy, but, also about sort of rational control, objective understanding, our sort of compulsion to reduce the web down to a line, to reduce things to clear causal explanations. Life is about the actual conditions in which things happen. We, reduce it to these causal narratives, which makes sense on, from the perspective of 30,000 feet. But on the ground level where life really happens, most of it is the accidental circumstances, not the linear narrative, right? This is the world of property and domination described by Rousseau, the second nature invented by civilization according to the, linear laws of abstract understanding. And it's crucial to underscore, as Solnit was describing, that the woman's body is equally relegated to property. The body of the woman and the work of labor, of child rearing, are characterized, in the Old Testament and Western understanding generally, as just punishment, deserved according to law. That the work of reproduction includes, of course, not just labor, but all the burden of sexuality, all the work, the embodied vulnerability, and even, as it says in Genesis, desire entailed by sexuality are justly deserved punishment and part of service to the male rule, patriarchal rule. The denigration of mind over body, male over female, white over black, so many other privileged, binaries. Don't just disguise or suppress accidental material circumstances, but direct material dependence. For instance, our brain co-evolved directly in relation to the evolution of the female body, especially the size of the birth canal. So that's an incredibly cruel irony of patriarchy, that our mental capacity to think of law, represent the law, and impose it on the material world is absolutely dependent on precisely what Genesis describes as just punishment, condition of the possibility of the idea of law, the idea of patriarchy. It owes itself to the female reproductive system, and then turns around and punishes it, blames it, and persecutes it. The female's body is persecuted not just by all the levels of neglect and disrespect that I was talking about before, vulnerability to violence, to the pain and disease and work of sexuality, but also through cultural restriction, demanding indeed impossible standards of beauty, of acceptable female appearance, which, like this Photoshop that amazingly target precisely that hip size, it's the same model, these two women, that allows for the demonization of the body by the brain in the first place. So Blake's phrase, mind forged manacle, is not a metaphor. Like, he's talking about actual cruel coercive force on the body by our cultural ideologies, which Blake wants us to notice are distorted, are sick, by exposing this corruption of cultural ideals. In Eliot's sense, there is a kind of love to that, to paying attention to the illness, rather than treating it as wholesome. Noticing the embodied cost of our rationality, objectivity, patriarchy, and so on is the mission of a novel like Frankenstein, right? Noticing the creature, developing an empathy for the creature's body. And moreover, as I emphasized, the body of the creature's mate. These anonymous, embodied victims of this reality dictated by ideals of, Promethean control, Promethean power that require sacrifice, that assert themselves like that bolt of lightning through the destruction of the tree of life. Eliot asks us to bear witness or remember what Solnit calls the obliterated, the forgotten lives, as a kind of anonymous rhythm of loving heartbeats and sobs. Blake likewise asks us to think about kind of rhythm and patterning web of material interactions in the environment, interactions that deconstruct our rigid prejudicial binaries, even the binary between health and disease. It's like the binary between wholesome garden plant and a weed. It's like what counts as a plant, what counts as a weed. Sort of an arbitrary judgment, like racism. What I'm saying here about the sick rose, that there's a salutary effect. The disease performs a salutary function by exposing the corruption of supposed health. I think that's part of what we're experiencing now with COVID. So many of the people that suffer from COVID are people that were already suffering. We're being forced to recognize the disease is making us recognize systemic costs that weren't being as recognized before. The Clod and the Pebble likewise examines a strict binary, between selfish and selfless love, contrasts them diametrically, but uses metaphors from the environment that deconstruct that diametrical opposition. We notice ways in which the clod and the pebble are not, in fact, so diametrically posed as selfish and selfless love, heaven and hell, and so on. Pebbles are in a way made out of clod. A crushed clod might eventually become a pebble, and vice versa. These metaphors also tell us something about language and about poetry, about communication. The selflessness of the clod amounts to a kind of self-cancellation. Selfless love, it's easy to call it virtuous, but what good is it if it just is self-destroying? Likewise with the pebble, it's easy to find fault with the, absolute selfishness. But the pebble allows the brook to warble out these meters meet. It allows the brook to sing. The poetry is associated. These meters meet are a function of the pebble, even as they condemn the pebble. I think that's really amazing. He's asking us to think about these environmental phenomena, the sound of the warbling brook, the sound of the crushed clod, because these environmental phenomena teach us about the subtleties of interrelatedness that our own concepts overlook. So just by paying attention to our sensuous experience, we're instructed about shortcomings of our thinking. So we're learning from the material world, learning from our sensuous experience, patterns of reality that our understanding doesn't grasp. So I hope this is helpful for understanding Rebecca Solnit's kind of paradoxical, enigmatic description of this painting on the left. The point I want to make is that, or the point I think Solnit's making, is that the artwork deconstructs the strict either-or of victim liberation or domination liberation. There's an expressiveness and intelligence, a communication of the complexity and nuance of embodied life that is not reducible to that black and white either or. So Solnit writes, in Fernandez's painting, the white fabric and expressive creases and shadows is a bedsheet. It speaks of houses and beds, of what happens in beds and then gets washed out, of cleaning house, of women's work. This is what it's about, but not what it is. The woman who is represented is obscured, but the woman who represents is not. The representation of being obscured, of the obliteration, the oppression, the sacrifice, the vulnerability of women's bodies. But it goes beyond just that in the detail with which it represents that obliteration. We're noticing material details. It compels us, if it does compel us. I think the point of art is that it's not prescriptive. That's, in a way, precisely my point. But if we're moved by it, if we enjoy looking at it, it's making us notice a complexity in the material world, like the clod and the pebble, that, again, these blunt conceptual categories overlook. It's a complexity in activity. We're seeing that the work of expression, it's like the rhythm of the heartbeats and sobs. It's anonymous. It's moving us. It's telling us something about material experience that's not reducible to proprietary ownership or identity. Blake's The Lamb, simple seeming on the surface, but I think it offers another really great example of what I'm talking about in its deconstruction of the various binaries, between God and man, teacher and student, human and animal. Begins as a kind of catechism with the authoritative teacher's voice posing rhetorical questions, unmistakably in a hierarchical manner. But it ends by making God and child and lamb, all these categories indistinguishable. Who's blessing who? Lamb and God and child are all images of one another, formal variations on one another, like a kind of dance, yet kind of rhythmic unfolding of one into the next that we participate in as we read the song, as we say the song, as the child speaks the song. It tells us, it enacts an intertwining of these categories that our mind can't grasp, but that our singing can.